You're standing in the agora of ancient Sparta in the 4th century BCE, watching what should be the most powerful warriors in the Greek world. But something's wrong. Where there should be thousands of bronze-clad Spartiates, you see only a few hundred. The legendary military machine that once terrified all of Greece is crumbling, not from enemy swords, but from something far more insidious. Before we dive into this shocking tale of how obsession destroyed an empire, if you enjoy uncovering the dark truths behind history's greatest civilizations, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. The Spartans were warriors, iron-hearted, disciplined, unbeatable, until they weren't. What brought down the fiercest military machine of the ancient world? A sword? A siege? No, something far more subtle and disturbing. Their obsession with keeping their bloodlines pure may have been their greatest downfall. What you're about to discover is the twisted tale of how two royal families, locked in a centuries-long competition to preserve their pure bloodlines, slowly strangled their own civilization to death. This is the story of genetic obsession, political paranoia, and how the very traditions that made Sparta legendary became the poison that destroyed it. Beneath Sparta's tough exterior lay a deep-rooted weakness that would slowly eat away at their society from within. The Spartan obsession with keeping royal bloodlines pure became a dangerous game that lasted for centuries. In their efforts to protect the nobility from outside influence, Sparta's rulers built a system that slowly turned against them. Built on tight-knit intermarriage, social isolation, and a shrinking population that they couldn't stop. This story explores how Sparta's ruling dynasties, believing themselves superior in lineage, slowly destroyed their own people through centuries of closed marriages and exclusion. With heiresses marrying cousins to protect land, kings accusing one another of being impure, and a dwindling citizen population, the famed warrior society collapsed, not in battle, but in the bedroom. Unlike most ancient monarchies, Sparta crowned two kings instead of one. This dual system was supposed to create balance, but it often created more problems than it solved. These rulers came from two powerful royal families, the Agiads and the Eurypontids. The idea was to keep power in check and create balance at the top. But in practice, it trapped Sparta in a dangerous cycle of elite isolation. Both royal families became obsessed with protecting their bloodlines from any outside influence. Intermarriage within the narrow pool of Spartan nobility was duty. And by narrow, we're talking about a family tree shaped more like a wreath than a branch. Purity of bloodlines was treated as paramount, and over time, that very obsession weakened the structure of Spartan society. In order to maintain this obsession with purity, both dynasties married within a limited aristocratic circle. Generation after generation, the same families intermarried, creating serious problems. Over generations, this created a genetic bottleneck that impacted not just the royal families, but the entire upper class of Spartan citizens, known as Spartiates. These were the only people allowed full rights in the state. Rights that included property ownership, military command, and political leadership. But by the 4th century BCE, this elite circle had started to crumble. Ancient writers like Aristotle, Xenophon, and Plutarch described a serious crisis known as oliganthropia, which meant they were literally running out of people. Some sources say there were fewer than 1,000 true Spartans left. Others claim the number had plummeted below 700. What's most shocking is that this collapse wasn't caused by war, plague, or famine. It came from their own rigid marriage rules. The Agiads and Eurypontids were not just rivals, they were mirrors of each other's obsessions. Both royal families were deeply obsessed with preserving their legitimacy and noble status. To keep power firmly within their own families, they arranged marriages between close relatives, cousins, second cousins, and even uncles marrying nieces. The goal was simply prevent outsiders from ever getting a foothold in the royal bloodline. But the consequences were devastating. Ancient historians like Herodotus, Plutarch and Xenophon traced these complicated family connections, and what they found was a web of marriages that grew more tangled with each generation. Marriages were strategic, but not in the way most royal houses used them for diplomacy or forming alliances. Sparta's marriages all turned inward, designed to keep the bloodline unchanged. While most Greek states allowed intermarriage across different aristocratic houses, or even commoners, Sparta didn't. Marriages among royals and elite Spartiates were treated almost like religious ceremonies, with strict rules about. When Spartan king Agasicles was asked about their declining numbers, he said, "Enough to keep all bad men away." But the reality was far more concerning. As a result of this closed-off system, the noble families of Sparta became increasingly interrelated. With each generation, cousins married cousins, and their children faced the same limited choices. The royal bloodline became so concentrated that it created what we now know as a genetic bottleneck. What started as a way to protect noble status slowly became a trap that Sparta couldn't escape. Plutarch and Xenophon both describe how marriages were arranged solely to preserve land, power, and bloodline purity. What they couldn't know then is what modern genetics tells us now. This kind of isolation weakens populations over time. This created an extremely exclusive upper class in Spartan society. It also made conflicts between the royal families almost inevitable. In the early 5th century BCE, a bitter rivalry erupted between two kings that shows just how toxic this obsession with purity had become. A fierce and deeply personal conflict unfolded between King Cleomenes I of the Agiad line and King Demaratus of the Eurypontid family. This was a vicious fight over who had the purer bloodline. Cleomenes accused Demaratus of being illegitimate, questioning his right to rule based on his ancestry. According to Herodotus, Cleomenes went so far as to bribe the Oracle of Delphi to support his claims against Demaratus. It was an attack on the very foundation of Sparta's government. The results were swift and brutal. Demaratus was stripped of his crown and forced into exile, leaving behind a kingdom now divided by suspicion. This episode revealed how Sparta's obsession with bloodline purity had become a weapon that could destroy the government itself. Herodotus writes that questions about blood purity were tearing the leadership apart. The two kings couldn't work together. Instead of facing external threats like Persia as a united force, they spent their energy undermining each other over questions of ancestry. This wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout Spartan history, similar disputes would arise, with bloodline purity used as a tool to attack political opponents. The most serious consequence of Sparta's obsession with bloodline purity was demographic collapse. By the 4th century BCE, the number of full citizens was dropping at an alarming rate. Plutarch, in his Life of Agis, points to this as a major crisis. Aristotle called the problem oliganthropia, literally meaning too few men. Aristotle observed, although the country is capable, they numbered not even 1,000. This was a dramatic fall for a society that once dominated Greece. In a military state like Sparta, population numbers were crucial. Fewer Spartiates meant fewer warriors, fewer leaders, and fewer voices in government. But instead of adapting to solve this crisis, Spartan leaders doubled down on their exclusivity. The solution was never to expand citizenship or reward outsiders for their service. Even the Perioikoi and the Helots, who served the state faithfully, were denied any path to full citizenship. No matter how skilled, brave, or loyal they were, if they weren't born into the right bloodline, they remained excluded. This stubborn exclusivity made the population crisis worse. Some noble families had no male heirs, while others were forced to marry their daughters within an ever-shrinking circle of relatives. The society was closing in on itself, becoming smaller and weaker with each generation. When families had no male heirs, Spartan law allowed women to inherit property. This might sound progressive, but these heiresses weren't free to marry whoever they chose. Instead, they were typically paired with close relatives to keep the property within the same family. This often meant uncles marrying nieces, or marriages between first cousins. Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus describes how women could become wealthy landowners, but always under strict controls designed to maintain bloodline purity. Plutarch noted that the greater part of the wealth of Sparta was in the hands of the women, but these women had very limited choices about marriage partners. What the Spartans didn't understand is what modern genetics has shown us. Generations of marriages between close relatives can have serious biological consequences. While we can't go back and examine ancient Spartans medically, the long-term effects of this intermarriage likely contributed to their demographic collapse. The system designed to preserve Sparta's strength was quietly undermining it from within. By the 3rd century BCE, the crisis was so severe that some leaders tried to implement radical changes. Reformers like Agis IV and Cleomenes III proposed land redistribution, debt forgiveness, and expanding citizenship to more people. They could see that Sparta's rigid traditions were destroying the state, but every attempt at reform faced fierce resistance from the established aristocracy, who saw any change as a threat to their power and status. When Cleomenes III tried to fix the system, he faced such strong opposition that he had to exile his opponents and confiscate their property just to move forward. The resistance was deeply cultural. The old elite refused to abandon the very traditions that were killing their society. Plutarch describes how Agis IV tried to restore equality and strengthen Sparta, but found no friends where he thought he had many, and enemies where he thought there were none. The reforms were too little, too late. The damage from centuries of rigid exclusivity was too deep to reverse. The legendary Spartan military that once terrified enemies across Greece began to weaken as the population shrank. In its prime, every Spartan male was trained as a warrior from childhood, creating an unmatched fighting force. But by the 4th century BCE, there simply weren't enough Spartans left to maintain their military dominance. For the first time in their history, Sparta had to rely on foreign mercenaries to fill their ranks. This was a betrayal of everything Sparta claimed to represent. The decline went beyond numbers. Discipline suffered, morale dropped, and the reputation that once made enemies flee began to fade. Plutarch captured this tragic decline perfectly when he wrote, "Sparta had become but a shadow of her former self, dressing her ruins in the armor of a dead past." So when the real threats emerged, first from Macedonia, then from Rome, Sparta wasn't prepared. The elite warrior class had shrunk to a point where it couldn't defend the city on its own, and the ironclad social system made it almost impossible to bring in fresh blood. The state that had once led Greece through fear and might now stood defenseless, trapped in the rigid traditions that had once made it great. At the height of its power in the 5th century BCE, Sparta had the most disciplined and feared military in the ancient world. It had crushed Athens in the Peloponnesian War and held sway over vast parts of Greece. Its warriors were legends, its laws strict, and its leadership revered. But beneath all that strength was a fragile foundation, a shrinking citizen base, an elite class obsessed with protecting its bloodline, and a political system that couldn't adapt to new realities. Sparta's fall wasn't sudden. It was a long unraveling from the inside out. Sparta was built on an extreme social model. Full citizens were a tiny minority known as Spartiates. Beneath the ruling Spartiates were the perioikoi, free men who lived in surrounding towns. They weren't citizens, but they played a crucial role in society by managing trade, craftsmanship, and other essential services the Spartans themselves avoided. And below them were the helots, a massive underclass of state-owned serfs. The helots outnumbered the Spartans many times over, yet they lived in harsh conditions, constantly monitored and suppressed, their presence a reminder of how dependent Sparta had become on a rigid social hierarchy. This tiered system worked barely when the Spartiate population was strong enough to keep control. But as the Spartiates declined, the imbalance became unsustainable. Xenophon, in Constitution of the Lacedaemonians, writes that the Spartans were taught from an early age to live in hardship, eat sparingly, and value obedience above all. But even he, a great admirer of Sparta, noted that the laws had become perverted, and the spirit of Lycurgus, the legendary Spartan lawgiver, had been lost. With so few Spartiates left and so many helots underfoot, revolts became a constant threat. The Spartan state grew paranoid, initiating brutal suppressions like the Cryptia, a secret police-like institution where young Spartans killed promising helots to prevent uprising. Sparta's end didn't come in a glorious final battle. Instead, it was a slow fade into irrelevance that took place over centuries. The decline was caused not by external enemies, but by internal flaws that the Spartans refused to address. At its peak in the 5th century BCE, Sparta had the most feared military in the ancient world. It had defeated Athens, controlled much of Greece, and seemed unstoppable. But beneath that strength was a foundation built on exclusion, rigid tradition, and a shrinking population. Sparta was built on an extreme social hierarchy that worked only when the ruling class was large enough to maintain control. Full citizens, Spartiates, were a small minority. Below them were the perioikoi, and at the bottom were the helots. The helots vastly outnumbered the Spartans, but as the Spartan population shrank, this imbalance became dangerous. With so few Spartans left, revolt became a constant threat. The state became paranoid, creating institutions like the Cryptia, a secret police force that assassinated promising helots to prevent uprisings. Aristotle observed the core problem. They failed to see that prosperity comes from many citizens doing well, not just a few. He criticized Sparta for allowing wealth and power to concentrate in too few hands while the broader population declined. According to Plutarch, by the time of King Agus IV, around 244 BCE, scarcely 700 genuine Spartans remained, of whom perhaps 100 possessed land. A society that once ruled much of Greece had been reduced to fewer than 1,000 full citizens. Sparta's unwillingness to change politically sealed its fate. While other Greek states expanded citizenship, embraced trade, or formed new alliances, Sparta clung to traditions that no longer worked. When reformers tried to save the state, they faced violent opposition. Agus IV attempted to redistribute land and restore citizen numbers, but he was arrested and executed along with his mother and grandmother. The final blow came in 146 BCE when Rome conquered Greece. Unlike other cities that were destroyed, Sparta was allowed to continue existing, but only as a shadow of its former self. It became a curiosity for Roman tourists rather than a power to be feared. The state that once dominated through strength and discipline had become irrelevant. Not through conquest, but through its own inability to adapt. Sparta's collapse was a slow death caused by inflexibility. The obsession with bloodline purity led to intermarriage, population decline, and political dysfunction. Plutarch summarized it perfectly. Sparta fell, not from invasion, but from decay within. Modern historians can trace a clear pattern. The dual kingship created competition. Competition led to purity obsessions. Purity obsessions led to genetic problems. Genetic problems led to population collapse. And population collapse led to military weakness and eventual irrelevance. Sparta's fall wasn't one event. It was the result of centuries of rigid thinking that couldn't adapt to changing times. The story of Sparta is often told as an inspiring tale of discipline, honor, and military excellence. But the real lesson is more complex and more cautionary. In trying to preserve their strength through purity, Sparta's rulers engineered their own downfall. They closed their society, excluded potential allies, and mistook rigid tradition for wisdom. History shows us that even the strongest societies can collapse if they refuse to adapt. The very qualities that made Sparta great, discipline, order, and loyalty to tradition, became chains that prevented them from surviving in a changing world. So when we remember Sparta's legendary warriors and their incredible achievements, we should also remember how it ended. Sparta was not conquered by superior enemies, it was destroyed by its own inability to change. True strength is about the wisdom to adapt when circumstances change. And when purity becomes more important than survival, it stops being a virtue and becomes a slow poison that can kill entire civilizations.